Hi, everybody. We're going to try and get through just the last major thing we didn't get to in our notes this unit. Ran out of time with just about every class, so this should be where we got to. You can see that we're just going to cover the major migrations in world history, and we'll also get to major migrations in U.S. history. Both of those are required knowledge by the College Board. So I'll try and make it fast. It's pretty straightforward. Long story short, for major migrations in history, Europe at some point conquered basically everywhere in the world. You can see based on the map here that they've got different colors representing different countries. You've got predominantly Spanish stuff in the green areas, so Latin America, they conquered a lot early on. The Portuguese conquered stuff later, including around Brazil, parts of East and West Africa, and well, I guess this would be technically Southern Africa or Central Africa on the west and the east coast, and parts of India, parts of Southeast Asia, parts of China. Spain also managed to conquer the Philippines. So if you ever meet anyone who's Filipino, chances are decent that they have a Spanish last name. I have a Filipino friend whose last name is Bosque, which is Spanish for Portuguese. Pardon me, what am I talking about? Spanish for forest. So Spanish conquered a lot early on. Portuguese, right next door, came and conquered some other stuff right around the same time. Eventually, the British got involved, as did the Dutch and the French. The British conquered quite a bit in, of course, the 13 colonies, Canada, and then other parts of the world that aren't quite as prominent on this map. So this map goes from 1400 to 1700. The time period I've given you for this era of history known as colonialism is more from the 1500s to the 1800s. There wasn't a whole lot going on in the 1400s. Some stuff was conquered by Portugal around the mid 1400s, but really not much at all. The vast majority of stuff starts getting conquered around the year you can see 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So after that, long ship travel was fairly easy. So maybe not mid 1400s, but certainly late 1400s. You can see Vasco da Gama here, a Portuguese guy, goes all the way around to India and so on. So this date range, I don't really find that accurate, but for this map, it's not showing you other things that the British conquered because they hadn't done it yet. You may know the British also conquered India, eventually conquered South Africa. They conquered Australia. That's not reflected on this map. The French conquered a bunch of stuff. Only on this map, it shows you parts of Canada and what's now the U.S. They also conquered a bunch of Africa. Also worth adding that the British also conquered a bunch of Africa. So keep in mind that in order from largest to smallest, the British conquered the most stuff eventually. The French conquered the second most stuff. And from there, I guess I'd probably say the Spanish, Portuguese, and the Dutch. Haven't talked much about the Dutch, but the Dutch really only conquer this area today, which is now known as Indonesia. Used to be called the Dutch East Indies. This is now the fourth largest country in the world by population. Not much Dutch influence that I know of there, but many of the other countries that were colonial conquerors, these five countries predominantly, left behind some major influence. Of course, we know these places conquered by Spain end up speaking Spanish. These places conquered by Portugal end up speaking Portuguese. We have some students here at Loyola that are from Mozambique, might have been Angola, can't remember which one. I've had one. The mother of the student speaks Portuguese, even though she's from Africa. Similarly, if you go to Macau, Macau was conquered by the Portuguese and other groups later, and you can still find Portuguese food there. You'll find lots of people in French parts of Africa, like Algeria up here, still speak French, or at least know some French, or have connections in France. Obviously, the British left behind all sorts of legacies around the world. We're not just talking about language. All these countries spread Christianity wherever they went. But in terms of language, English is still predominant here in India, in Australia, in South Africa, of course here, and in Canada. So the influence from all these places is pretty obvious. And if you're ever asked a question on a test, who conquered this area, and you don't know, some area, say Britain. That's the best choice because they conquered the most stuff. If you know that Britain didn't conquer that place, go with the French. If you know that the French didn't conquer it, at that point you're probably just, clueless. But British and the French are your best guesses in that order. Last thing I'll tell you is that you can easily figure it out if you know what language they speak somewhere, of course. All right, let's move on. The other one of the other major migrations you should be aware of is the transatlantic slave trade, which lasted from about the same time period as colonialism, 1500s to the 1800s. Hopefully, we know that most of the slave trade, which is called the transatlantic because they were crossing the Atlantic, was done mostly from Africa, involving African slaves. Roughly 13 million were taken over that 300-year time span. The thickness of these arrows tell you how many of them went to different places. The thickest arrow you can see, hopefully, is the one going towards the Caribbean. So while, of course, we have a legacy in the U.S. of slavery, hard to deny, compared to other places in Latin America and the Caribbean, our number of slaves was relatively small. Obviously, that's not meant to diminish the uh, horrible nature of slavery, but in many places it was at a much larger magnitude. The Caribbean in general had the most slaves, then South America, and then arguably, I guess, last place, the U.S. and Canada. Um, Trying to think if there's anything else to tell you about it. I don't think so. You should just be aware that the transatlantic slave trade involved slaves coming from mostly West Africa. You can see kind of where West and Central Africa, mostly to the Caribbean, South America, and a huge number. This is still I think it's now the second largest forced migration in world history. The largest forced migration, I think, according to some, is related to the Nazis in World War II. We also see some other trends in migration after the 1800s to the U.S. globally. We end up seeing, not just to the U.S., but in general, Chinese and, well, mostly the Chinese went to Southeast Asia and started to come to the Americas in the 1800s. The Chinese have, just like other European countries and America, have lots and lots of people, and so they often migrate somewhere. As China expanded, they expanded to places that you would probably guess they would expand to, nearby areas. So Chinese people still today live in large numbers in Vietnam, which is in Southeast Asia, or Cambodia, or Thailand, which are all in Southeast Asia. I was just doing a grad school project the other day, had to research a neighborhood in Chicago and find out about its background. And one area I looked at was a place called Little Vietnam. And while there's lots of Vietnamese people in the neighborhood known as Little Vietnam, there's also lots of Chinese people who had come from Vietnam. They had lived in Vietnam for a while, chose to move here. An update. Let's not do that. Don't care. So the Chinese moved to nearby areas, and then also, of course, not too hard to get across the ocean to come to the U.S., often working on railroads in the West Coast. As for U.S. migration, there's a few big trends. First of all, they had the slave trade, of course. We already talked about that from roughly the 1600s when the U.S. really started to be settled as a colony by the British until the early 1800s. That was when the slave trade was made illegal. People still brought in slaves illegally, but it was a little bit more difficult. From that point on, or in that same time period, we start seeing British colonists as well. Of course, we speak English here. That's because we were settled by the British. They weren't the only groups to come here from Europe. Of course, we ended up seeing lots of people come here from Germany and Ireland. If we were in class, I would ask you how many of you have German or Irish descent, and my guess would be that the majority of you would have German descent, and a huge number would also have Irish descent. Germans have still been, I believe they are still the largest immigrant group to have ever come to the United States. So lots of people today have German descent and Irish descent. They're second largest, I believe, still. So generally, you can summarize these two groups by saying that during this time period, early to late 1800s, you saw North and Western Europeans come to America. That also could include the British. So hopefully we know where these countries are by now since we've had our map quizzes. Germany and Ireland and Britain are generally North and Western Europe. That means that later we'll see people from the other parts of Europe come here. In other words, South and East Europe. So these South and Eastern Europeans are going to be people that are Italian, Polish, Russian, Jewish people, Greeks. They come after this North and Western European trend, starting in the late 1800s, going to the early 1900s. A critical and somewhat complicated piece of information to know is the U.S.'s restrictions on immigration. A quota, you may know, is either an upper limit or a lower limit on something. For example, police officers may have a quota on how many tickets they're supposed to give out every month or something, like a minimum number. But there's also quotas that are a maximum number. So quota can mean either a minimum or a maximum number of something. The U.S. Has had for about 40 years a quota system. Now we still have a version of this, but it's been improved. This quota system was biased towards non-European immigrants. The simple summary is that you were allowed to bring in 2% of the number of people already in your country, in the U.S., from the country of origin you're asking about in the 1910 census. So in the 1910 census, knowing what you know now about U.S. history, pretty much all the U.S. was European. The only people that would have been here that weren't European in nature would have been, a handful of people from Canada, Mexico, and Chinese immigrants that I've already told you about. And Africans wouldn't have counted as part of this to a great degree because we wouldn't have known what country they were from. So the vast majority of the U.S. population in 1910 was European. So mainly immigrants came from that continent or region, Western Europe or Eastern Europe. So the end result of this quota system was that if you could only bring in 2% of uh, the number of people that were here from that country in 1910, well, the vast majority of people had come from Europe. So the vast majority of our immigrants are still going to continue to be European. You're going to allow in only 2% of them, but that's still a huge number. Imagine if you had 100 people in the US from Europe and then one Chinese person, you'd bring in 2 Europeans and no Chinese people. So it's going to end up still skewing our migration. This is sort of a policy that masked the racism that was prevalent in the US and fear of foreign immigrants that were non European. It's sort of similar to what we see today with the Trump administration saying that he did not want any immigrants. He didn't say he didn't want them, but he talked about African countries being, I won't use his foul language, poop hole countries. Meanwhile, he asked why we couldn't get more immigrants from Norway. The answer is because they love their country and it's a great country and they wouldn't want to come here. They said so themselves. So the point is, we've long been biased towards immigration from Europe. Comes and goes in waves, but this policy of the quota system was a pretty clear way of masking that and encouraging more European immigration while discouraging non-European immigration. Bringing us to the modern day, the largest 2 chunks of migrants we get are people from nearby countries, especially China, Mexico. I suppose China's not that far away, it's just an ocean away. And so Mexico and China are the biggest ones. India also we get quite a bunch from, but the 2 biggest are Mexico and China. You can understand some of these. Mexico's nearby, and China has a large population, which is becoming upwardly mobile. Same with India, and they have lots of people that want to work towards a better life for themselves. Many of the Latin American migrants, of course, come here and work as migrant laborers, do low-wage jobs. Chinese and Indian people may also do those same jobs, but they often have more money or more education, so they end up doing things that seem stereotypical. You know, Indian people often own things like restaurants or convenience stores. Chinese people still seem to own a lot of laundromats. These aren't stereotypes, really. There are a lot of businesses that they have started. And of course, Mexican immigrants have as well. But the typical migrants we end up seeing are often guest workers who are here to do something like harvesting fruit or whatever. So still huge numbers from these groups. This chart kind of shows you in a very easy to understand way how our migration has changed almost from the beginning of the country in 1820 to 2014. The brownish colors are the European colors, and you can see here the quota system taking effect in the 20s, drastically reducing the number of people from all countries, but still the vast majority of immigrants coming here were from Europe. Once the quota system ends in the mid-60s, you start to see these numbers of non-European immigrants increase because that 2% limitation is not here. So then we see huge numbers of Latin American immigrants, of course largely Mexican, We see huge numbers of Asian immigrants, largely Chinese and Indian. Slight uptick in the amount of African immigrants, um, not many at all from Canada or Oceania. So this chart really just reflects, in a really simple to read way, how our immigration has changed. Mostly European, North and Western Europe, South and Eastern Europe, still European until modern day when we see lots of people from Latin America and Asia. Finally, the migration within the U.S. is important to be aware of. I showed you this in class a bit, just in a super simple drawing, but the U.S. is mostly a long country, east to west. We're not a very tall country, north to south. And we know people settled on the east coast in the 13 colonies. So as time passed by, people eventually moved further west. So most of our migration in the U.S. has been to the west. You should also be aware that recently, in this roughly 60-year time period, still continuing today till 2010, the population has generally moved farther south as well. Lots of old people want to stay warm and preserved for the wintertime. So these dots, if you haven't figured it out yet, show us the average center of our population. Obviously, we have people living north, south, east, and west of all these dots, but this is the average place for the center of our population. Slowly moving west as our country moved west, slowly moving south as people preferred warmer climates. So if you had to pick one compass direction, which direction has migration in the U.S. mostly been? Hopefully your answer is west. How has that changed in the last 60 years? Hopefully you know that it's started to go farther south, faster than any other time in U.S. history. Generally, then, we move west and a bit south. The last thing to tell you about, and then I promise I'm done, is the Great Migration. The Great Migration we've talked about a bit in class. This is a time period roughly from World War I to about 1970. The biggest times were about 1920 to 1950-ish, when a lot of African Americans in the South moved to the north. Not just to the north, some of them moved to the West Coast. This is during the Second Great Migration, so these green areas without the dots were the later migration. So I was talking mostly about the World War I to World War II migration. These huge numbers are the Great Migration that you may have heard about, mostly going from the south to the north, mostly to big cities where, like you see, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, so that they can get more work in factories and leave the racism of the South. Surely there were factory jobs up here. Also, surely there was racism, and we'll talk about that later. It was just a different brand of it. Better than in the South in many ways, although it's worth saying that Martin Luther King, when he came up here in 1960, when was it, 1965, I think, he was in Chicago for about 6 months. He'd already been in the South encountering racism there in terrible places like Birmingham or whatever. Sorry for families from Birmingham. And said that even still, Chicago is the most racist city he's ever been to. So was our racism better than the racism in the South? Not according to Martin Luther King, but certainly was better in many ways. All right, hope that all made sense. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.